Good morning, I'm Annie Larkin, the Associate Curator of Public Programs at the Amerind Museum, and welcome to From the Long Walk to the Skywalk, a brief history of the Hualapai people with Professor Jeffrey P. Shepard. Before we begin the program today, I want to acknowledge that Amerind is located in southeastern Arizona, on lands where the O'odham, Hopi, Oshwe, Yoeme, and Apache families lived for untold generations, and whose wisdom and traditions live on today in vibrant communities. We are grateful for what all of these communities, rich in history, have to teach us. Amerind would like to extend a special thank you to today's program sponsor, Arizona G&T Cooperatives. Their generous support has enabled Amerind to bring this free online programming to our audience today. Thank you also to our members and donors who enable Amerind to provide free online programming and fulfill Amerind's mission to promote the knowledge and understanding of the Native peoples of the Americas through research, education, conservation, and community engagement. To learn how you can assist Amerind in supporting its mission and programs by becoming a member or donor, please visit amerind.org. On November 20th at 11 a.m. Arizona time, Amerind will host the free online lecture, Comanches and Germans on the Texas Frontier, with Daniel Gallo and Christopher Wickham. Please visit the events section of Amerind's Facebook page or website, amerind.org, for the online program registration details. And Amerind is pleased to host a Mata Ortiz Pottery Show and Sale with pottery artist Aurelia Lopez. The Mata Ortiz Pottery Show and Sale will take place November 26th through the 28th from 10 a.m. until 4 p.m. each day at the Amerind Museum in Dragoon. For more information, visit the events section of Amerind's website or Facebook page. All right. Dr. Jeffrey P. Shepard is professor and chair of the Department of History at the University of Texas at El Paso. His first book, We Are an Indian Nation, A History of the Hualapai People, was published by the University of Arizona Press in 2010. His second book, The Guadalupe Mountain National Park, An Environmental History of the Southwest Borderlands, was published by the University of Massachusetts Press in 2019. His research and teaching interests focus on Native peoples in the Southwest, historical memory, public history, and borderlands history. And if you would like to ask any questions during the program today, please type in your question in the Q&A chat box. We'll gather those questions to share with our speaker after the presentation. And we are also recording today's program, and a link to the video will be sent out to all of our Zoom registrants later today. And with that, thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Shepard.
Thank you, Annie. Thank you for this great opportunity. Also want to thank the Amerind Foundation. Over the past 20 years or so, since I've been living in El Paso, I live in Las Cruces, working in El Paso, I've driven past the Amerind Foundation dozens of times and stopped in there, and it's really wonderful, wonderful resource. So I want to shift over to the PowerPoint presentation, and we'll get started on this talk. So before I really dive into this, essentially a narrative conversation about Hualapai history, I'm not going to read a paper. I really want to acknowledge the Hualapai Nation. I began this project as what became a book as my dissertation topic in 1998. And since then, the tribal members have been incredibly supportive, very thoughtful, very encouraging, also very critical. And this book is really sort of a dedication to Hualapai's past, present, and in the future. But in particular, I dedicated it to the memory of Manza Honga. And Manza was a friend and mentor. He was the director of the Cultural Resources Department, and he unfortunately passed away much too early. And so I dedicate the book to him. I also want to thank Lucille Wadahamaji, Wilfred Wataname, Marcy Cranen, and Loretta Jackson, and many other Hualapais. But these individuals particularly Lucille, were wonderful mentors, friends, and the book really couldn't have been possible without them. So the title of the talk today is From the Long Walk to the Skywalk, A Brief History of the Hualapai People. And I want to just kind of go over some of the main themes of the book. And then throughout the presentation today, I'll highlight a few main turning points and try to follow through with these themes. And I have a number of photographs and some quotations that sort of give a little bit of a human side to this general narrative. And then when I'm done with the presentation, I'm more than happy to talk with folks. And I don't necessarily want to say question and answer because I may not have all the answers. I spent a lot of time on this project, but really Hualapais themselves are the experts in their own histories. So the book is, I really try to ground the book in Hualapai perspectives and tell this story from their view of what it was like as members of really 13 bands of extended families struggling against Anglo expansion in what became Northwest Arizona, dealing with land dispossession, controlled by the Bureau of Indian Affairs. And in the process of dealing with all of these conflicts and confrontations, recast themselves as a modern Indian nation. And I really try to expand on this notion of being an indigenous nation. What does that mean? And so the book tries to balance critical examinations of colonialism and racism, but also an emphasis on persistence and adaptation, trying to narrate successes, but also the challenges of this particular Indian community. And so while I engage a good bit of theory in the book, I also try to write in a clear way that is accessible to many people and tries to foreground Native voices. And then I look at some of the common themes in American Indian history: social change, economic development, politics, and also sort of the legal dimensions of nation building. So very briefly, in the book, there's a process here. Writing a book, particularly about Indigenous peoples, should not be a solitary experience in which one is just in the archives. So we have to consider the power relations that scholars have when writing. We need to think about the ethics of research. Why are we writing a particular project? Do Native peoples have a say in the questions you ask and the stories that you tell? And so I try to balance decolonization. I recognize my positionality, and I tried to collaborate with them in as many ways as possible. So before I defended my dissertation, I requested permission from the tribal council to write about the Hualapais. And then when I was working on book review, revisions to the book, we created a Hualapai History Review Board, and they went through the draft a few times. The book is really based on an extensive archival foundation from the National Archives all the way down to the Mojave County Library and Museum. But there's also extensive tribal council minutes and resolutions and tribal newsletters. Again, starting this in around 1998 to the completion of the book in 2010, I spent a lot of time on the reservation, simply going to basketball games or to going celebrations, birthday parties, things like that. And I worked for the tribe in on a few contracts. And again, a number of interviews that I conducted with tribal members. So for folks who may not be familiar with the area, this is a somewhat common sort of map that looks at the language family, the language groups within the human language family. The Hualapai are here. One of the reasons why I like this map is that it indicates Spirit Mountain along the Colorado River. And this is Hualapai's origin place. And indeed, they call the Colorado River, I thought, also known as the spine. So the river is sort of the spine of their territory. And then also the modern reservations today. So you see Hualapai Reservation along about 108 miles of the Colorado River, and then the Havasupai down into the canyon, the Grand Canyon, the national park. And so their reservation is on the plateau and then goes down into the canyon. So Hualapais had relatively little interaction with Spain and with Mexico, primarily due to their location and other sort of demographic characteristics. Of also the landscape was really served as an obstacle to many of the Spanish and Mexican settlers. But after the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo and the United States took over the Mexican North, Anglo settlement in Northwest Arizona was very rapid and extremely violent following the migration of people to the California gold fields. So it was extremely violent and extremely rapid. There were vigilante groups that really hunted Hualapais and hunted Native people in California. So it was a very violent conquest. So a group killed Hualapai headman Wabayuma. The Arizona Miner, a newspaper, territorial newspaper, demanded the extermination of all hostiles in the region. This is common language during the time, from Texas to California and throughout the US West. The US cavalry and infantry were essentially hunting Hualapais. When I started to revise the dissertation for a book, I spent a lot of time in the National Archives looking at military records, these old military records written by an individual like Colonel William Redwood Price. And these were journals of him chasing and hunting Hualapais. And you can see some of the quotes here directly from his journals written by his hand with a quill pen, that he wanted to drive and harass the degenerate Hualapais until they were thoroughly whipped. You know, one entry in 8 November 1868, they surrounded and attacked rancheria of Hualapai Indians, killing 19 Indians and capturing 16 squaws and children. And so these entries continue extensively. So when we get into the 1870s, the US military is really trying to end what they called the, quote, Hualapai Wars. This really wasn't a war in the sense of a war of equal choice or mutual choice. The Hualapais were defending their homelands and trying to maintain access to springs and access to water and their Aboriginal homelands. But starting in 1874, the military relocated, sort of essentially rounded up Hualapais by gun and bayonet and marched them south to La Paz. And I'll show a map in a moment. This is an extremely violent march, resulting in the deaths of many Hualapais. One estimate has that 100 Hualapais died. And for a community of no more than 5,000, that's a lot of people. That's in the march itself, but when they were interned at the bottom of the Colorado River Indian Reservation, many more died. And so you can see some quotes here. Kate Crozer, all Hualapai Indians, we skipped off going down into Grand Canyon to get out of the way. Bob Shrum, in an interview recorded in 1944, says that the young and old Indians were unable to continue to the march to La Paz, and then Indian Honga. And so there are a number of these interviews that were collected after the long walk and then their escape. So almost 1 year after internment, Hualapais escaped this military reservation and tried to return northward. But in that 1 year interim, Anglo squatters moved onto their lands, ranchers were grazing cattle, and really took control over access to springs and other sources of water. And so this, quote, long walk and internment at La Paz and then the escape back is really a pivotal moment in Hualapai history. And I'll come back to this at the end of the presentation. And so here you can see the map of the Hualapai Reservation here. And then their internment at La Paz was down here. And they were marched during the early summer. And so this is the northern reaches of the Sonoran Desert. It was incredibly, incredibly hot and a very, very painful march. And then people fled and escaped after their internment. So there's about a 50-year period that I kind of look at between their escape from La Paz, the creation of the reservation, and then the Indian Reorganization Act in the 1930s. So there were a number of prominent Hualapai headmen, leaders such as Shrum, Hualapai Charlie, and others that demanded a reservation within their homelands. And sometimes there's a tendency to view reservations solely as prisons that people were forced to go to. Now that is true in many, many regards, but in some cases, the reservations, when compared to having nothing and having to struggle in a territory populated by Anglos that were still hunting and killing them, the reservation provided some degree of security. So you have Shrum again saying that, you know, they do not want starvation. They do not want to go back towards La Paz. Anglos also wanted them off the public domain. And so some Anglos were clamoring to force them onto a reservation. Many Hualapais were fully engaged in a wage labor economy by the time the federal government, President Chester Arthur, approved the creation of a reservation in 1883. So this was about 12 years after the end of treaty making. And so this was an executive order reservation, which still essentially has the same legal strength as a treaty reservation. The problem, however, was that the reservation encompassed only about 1/6 of Hualapai traditional homelands. And I'll talk about why that was a challenge. But simultaneously, the Santa Fe Railway, Transcontinental Railway, was moving into Hualapai lands and essentially claimed that they owned 1/3 of the Hualapai Reservation. And so this creates an incredible problem for the Bureau of Indian Affairs, the superintendents, because this began a land claims conflict on the Hualapai Reservation that it took a US Supreme Court case to resolve in 1941. So here you see this line here, the Hualapai Aboriginal Territory. And then the shaded, the hash marks here is the Hualapai Reservation. And their Aboriginal territory, of course, included Kingman, Arizona. So in one particular chapter, I look at this question of the colonization of space. And this is an important sort of notion in which US map makers came into the region and renamed Hualapai land and sort of recategorized it and brought it into Anglo maps. And mapping played an important part in US conquest of the West. So renaming indigenous territory and landmarks, using new maps. This devalued Hualapai knowledge of the land. They retained that knowledge, of course, but this process of remapping divided their land into private property and public domain. Of course, this land was taken. And as I mentioned briefly previously, the reservation was a very contradictory place. On the one hand, it was a protected space, but it was also a colonial space in which the Bureau of Indian Affairs could really target Hualapais and assimilate them. But again, the problems on the reservation were that Anglo ranchers controlled springs on the reservation, and the railroad was also claiming 1/3 of the land. And then on this part of the plateau, it was somewhat poor quality for farming. it was reasonably good for ranching, but the Colorado River being thousands of miles down into the canyon made it very difficult, impossible almost, to bring water up to the top of the plateau. So there was a number of Hualapais that just could not live on the reservation, and then some of them just refused to live on the reservation. So the Big Sandy Band, for instance, had very little interest in moving there. And then Hualapais around Kingman lived in what Anglos somewhat derisively called Indian Town. So this is an official map from the Hualapai, and it's a little bit hard to see the hash marks down here, but this is part of my interest and my argument about 13 bands of Hualapai over a century or so, struggling with being sort of recategorized as the Hualapai Nation. So the Hualapai is one band of Hualapai. There were other bands of Hualapais. English translations would be Clay Springs, Grass Springs, Surbat Mountain, Hackberry. So all these different bands had different names for themselves and lived in different areas. But the federal government called the reservation the Hualapai Reservation. And that privileged one band. And so this created some difficulties for some bands to move to a reservation that was essentially named after one band. And so these are some of the issues that I kind of investigate in the book. So the early 20th century, again, Hualapais are living on and off the reservation and fully engaged in the wage labor economy, encountering, pretty endemic vitriolic racism, growing poverty and health problems, trachoma, tuberculosis. During this time period, progressive era reforms targeted Native people to assimilate them into the US body politic through institutions such as the Superintendency and the Truxtun Canyon Agency. It's about 12 to 15 miles southwest from the reservation. Sometimes it's the Valentine Agency or the Truxtun Canyon Agency, but it's also the location of the Valentine Indian Boarding School. And there's a very interesting story here, and in a nutshell, some Hualapai children were sent off to boarding schools, particularly in Albuquerque, and they died. And some parents, knowing that it was going to be somewhat impossible to keep their children at home, and with the Bureau of Indian Affairs taking their children from them, they said, well, we'll consider sending our children to school if you put a boarding school essentially in our homeland. And so that's what they did. The BIA put this boarding school in their homeland. Now that didn't stop a lot of the corporal punishment, the pain and suffering of the children, but it did actually result in Hualapai parents and families living on the agency school grounds and trying to attend the school to try to take care of their children. And there's more to talk about that, but for the sake of time. Again, vocal tribal leaders, Shrum, Hualapai Charlie, Kawaro, wanted the superintendent at the time, Shell, to evict white ranchers from the reservation and to evict the Santa Fe Railway, because the railroad went directly through the reservation, directly through Peach Springs. And today it still causes tremendous difficulties. Again, they had no access to water for farming on the reservation, the Colorado River being so far down into the canyon. But they also used the railroad to move across the reservation, to move across the region. So Hualapais were getting on and off the railroad, going all the way out to California, across to New Mexico, working in the wage labor economy. And this interestingly gave them some degree of freedom, but again, within a settler colonial context. Throughout the time period from 1887, with the establishment of the Dawes Allotment Act, to its termination in 1934, the Hualapai Reservation was not allotted. As you see in other reservations across the US West, it did not suffer from the degree of checkerboarding that other reservations experienced. But they also experienced the standard criminalization of their religion, criminalization of their language. And so to my point about progressive era reformers, so we have two Anglo era reformers going to Hualapai home, and again, trying to transform, in this case, Hualapai women into versions of working class or middle class Anglo-Christian women. They focused on questions of domesticity and, quote, hygiene, again, trying to Christianize them, altering labor patterns, and of course, trying to end the use of the Hualapai language. Here we have some fairly well-known photographs, Hualapai Charlie with the feathers, and then some tribal members. I think that these were some members of an early sort of business council. Another photograph from the early 1900s, the Hualapai family. Now, this might not have been the entire family, but it's a very interesting photograph. And a lot of these images came from the Mojave Museum of History and Culture. And then a really fascinating photograph that has so many things to unpack. The Santa Fe Railway, of course, had these hotels and restaurants. The Santa Fe Railroad is an iconic institution throughout the American Southwest in terms of marketing and recreating an imagined version of the Southwest. And so here are Hualapai women, and presumably, perhaps, trying to get on the railroad to move across the region. And then you see the early automobile in the back. So one of the things that I looked at for the early 20th century is Hualapai governance and politics. And so many Hualapais, particularly younger ones that were born after the reservation was created, engaged the language of modern rights and used modern strategies to defend their land and identity. So they critiqued the Indian Bureau, but also, even despite some generational differences, young and old leaders collaborated. So you've got individuals like Shrum collaborating with Fred and Jim Mahone. Mahone was a scout. Jim Mahone was a scout in the wars against Apaches. Jim Fielding, Philip Kosula. So these are individuals that were born as far back as the 1850s and 1860s, collaborating with individuals born in the 20th century. So Roger Havatone, again, using this language of freedom: we are not free people, we are prisoners. We were here first before any whites came into this country. And many of the Hualapai critiques were at Anglos coming into their homelands. They were very pointed about white people coming into their land. There was collaboration with regional organizations such as the Mission Indian Federation in Southern California, which had members throughout Southern and Western Arizona, the National Organization, the Society for American Indians, and then a number of Hualapai, various iterations of Hualapai organizations, from the Red Men Self-Dependent of America to the pre-1938 Hualapai Tribal Council. So on the left, you see Fred Mahone. And Mahone was one of the most vocal individuals on the reservation, particularly fighting against the BIA, their abuses, the lack of citizenship rights and voting rights. And then he was also the main protagonist against the Santa Fe Railway. And Jim Fielding was an older tribal advocate, politician. And so individuals like this, you know, Fielding gave some of the younger men a sense of what Hualapai culture was about and history and tradition. And Mahone was able to really navigate sort of early and mid 20th century politics. And Mahone also is one of the first to own, one of the first Hualapais to own a vehicle. So here you see Mahone. This may be at a gas station. This may be on the Hualapai Reservation, or it might be in Kingman. Here, I think it says land office. I'm not entirely sure. I've been unable to identify the location. But again, Mahone sort of engaging in the modern language of rights and, you know, essentially modernity, but for traditional ends of Hualapai homelands and Hualapai rights. So most Hualapais were not citizens until the 1924 Indian Citizenship Act, but some of them did not want citizenship. In the United States, we tend to think that US citizenship is coveted by everybody, and sometimes it's not. Again, Hualapais had their own ways of acknowledging their own membership and sense of belonging, and some didn't want it. On the other hand, some did want it because they saw it as the best way to use the legal system to protect their land and for other purposes. So again, wage labor across the area, and despite, you know, institutional segregation, there was sometimes interaction on a social level with celebrations throughout the year, such as the 4th of July. A lot of Hualapais served in World War I, but did not have pensions. And this was the issue of pensions. It was very contentious because Hualapai scouts demanded pensions, and so did their relatives and widows. So this is one of the many claims that Hualapai would make against the state for their service. Some Hualapais just took private property allotments on the quote public domain, thinking that that was their best opportunity to choose where they wanted to live. And throughout the 1920s until the early 30s, again, very few Hualapais lived on the reservation due to the ranchers on the reservation and the railroad. So there were some small sort of communities or enclaves that lived throughout Hualapai Aboriginal homelands, but they had taken up private property allotments. And so this is one of my favorite sort of photographs, a really iconic photograph, presumably during a 4th of July celebration. And so you see this right here is Hualapai Charlie, and you see the amazing headdresses. But the individual right here, it's just such an iconic image with his hand up in the arm, maybe in protest, maybe in celebration. And then in the back here, you have Hualapais with American flags. So it's a very interesting sort of mixed hybrid social moment in which Hualapais are announcing to the Anglo community, we are still here, engaging in some displays of patriotism. But as again here, I would like to hope a little bit of protest. And then I had mentioned service in World War I, Sans Waskagame, his service in World War I. And this photograph is possibly taken in France. He died in the war, and Anglos sort of transformed him into a model, quote, good Indian, and named a VFW post after him. Another one of my favorite images, and this is Millie Grover in the 1930s, and this is her vehicle, and it's really a testament to women's mobility, women's agency, and engagement with elements of the modern world, but also people used vehicles and the train to maintain family and band identities, to engage in dances throughout the Southwest. So another one of these sort of combination hybrid sort of moments. The 1934 Indian Organization Act was really a pivotal moment for the Hualapai. It was part of the Indian New Deal programs of the New Deal era in the 1930s, but it was a very problematic act. It was a national effort to create standard governments for Native political leadership using formulaic constitutions. And these constitutions conflicted with a lot of traditional Native political roles and processes and relationships between leaders, communities, and bands. And in fact, many tribal governments across the US rejected them, saying that we have our own forms of government. We do not want these. But the Bureau of Indian Affairs, the Department of Interior, and John Collier in particular, really pushed through these kind of boilerplate governments across the United States. They gave Native people very little time to think about them, and they attached a lot of financial benefits and political benefits to approval of these acts, of these constitutions. But one of the sort of nefarious elements of this process, and this happened with the Hualapai, is that the BIA had people vote, and they didn't really explain the voting process and didn't give people much time to vote. And for the Hualapai, if you voted no, that counted as a no vote. If you voted yes, that counted as a yes vote. But the people that were on the tribal rolls that did not vote at all, the BIA counted them as yes votes. And so in my research, I tallied things up. And if you tallied up the active no votes and the non-votes, it's actually more than the yes votes. But the federal government wanted tribes to accept these governments. So in 1955, the Hualapai revised their constitution, and then again did it in 1991. So after World War II, a lot of things began to change on the reservation, in part because more and more Hualapais were moving onto the reservation. The New Deal programs, the Indian Civilian Conservation Corps, and a number of other things made the reservation much more hospitable. Also, the Bureau of Indian Affairs moved the ranchers off the reservation. So more and more people were moving onto the reservation. Another thing that helped was the resolution of this longstanding land claims conflict with the Santa Fe Railway. And this case went up to the United States Supreme Court, the US v. Santa Fe Railway, in 1941. And the railroad claimed that in 1866 land grant gave them claims to the land that became the Hualapai Reservation. And it was about 350,000 acres of land. And the reservation was like 997,000 acres, so about a third. And again, Fred Mahone pushed this case. And this case became, after they won, an internationally known case that was cited in New Zealand, Australia, and Canada, in part because it essentially acknowledged indigenous land claims and also oral histories as fact. And Christian McMillan wrote a really wonderful book on this, looking at Fred Mahone and the land claims. So like many Native people, they had very high rates of service and volunteerism in the war, but their service and their volunteer for a war to save democracy made them think that when they came home, that they would also have democracy and that their sacrifice would be rewarded in the growing early civil rights movement. Their service shaped their activism, sense of patriotism, but it also began to contribute to a sense of Hualapai nationalism as generations were being born on the reservation, having greater claims to a sense of citizenship, a sense of rights. And it was also fueled by the termination and relocation movement of from the early 1950s to the late 1960s, early 1970s. And this was part of the federal government's attempt to, quote, get out of the Indian business. And there's a series of policies and initiatives basically the goal was to dissolve all reservations and end government to government relationships between Indian nations and the US. And this resulted in about 100 reservations being extinguished, but it fueled a sense of nationalism and activism among Native people. Also, the very large court case, Arizona versus California, that adjudicated over the Colorado River water rights, this excluded the Hualapai. And so that also sort of fueled a sense of their nationalism and indignation. It also fueled their attempt to build about an 800-foot tall dam on the Colorado River on their reservation. And it was called the Bridge Canyon Dam and sometimes the Hualapai Dam. It was very, very controversial within the Hualapai community and also, of course, throughout the region. And so this is just a wonderful photograph that includes the founding generation of the National Congress of American Indians. The National Congress of American Indians was a multinational organization roughly similar to the NAACP, but really focusing on tribal rights and sovereignty. And right down here, this is Fred Mahone. Right down here, this is Fred Mahone. So the individual that had one of the first Hualapais to have a car, that pushed the court case against the Santa Fe Railway, and he was a Hualapai delegate to the NCAI. And I received this, I was gifted this by Camille Nighthorse, the granddaughter of Mahone. And she and I had a lot of conversations about Fred Mahone, her grandfather. So during the 1950s, it's a transitional era politically for two basic reasons. On the one, that there was individual voting for the tribal council, but there was an ongoing hereditary leader. And so that was a very interesting sort of combination of political traditions. But in 1955, when the council and the Hualapai revised their constitution that ended the practice of electing hereditary leaders to be the chairman. The 55 Constitution also expanded their powers. And then in 1991, they revised the Constitution again. And that particular constitutional revision was led in part by Joseph T. Fliesaway. And Joe Fliesaway is also a very good friend and mentor. And he, for a while, was the Chief Justice of the Hualapai. And he was a council member earlier on then and helped revise the Constitution in 1991. So we're kind of wrapping up here a little bit. And so there were Great Society programs that targeted Native communities, particularly reservations. In the 1950s and 1960s, one of the very unique aspects of Hualapai history and political culture is the presence of a strong female leadership. Hualapai women were on the council in the 1950s, and then tribal chairwomen, Louise Benson, for instance, but also Lucille Watahamaji, who's an internationally known language rights activist. So we have the 1975, quote, Self-Determination Act that allowed tribes to gain more control over contracting. The bilingual program that Lucille really spearheaded as an international model. She started that in the 1970s. Hualapai started the first native-owned river runners business in the 1970s. It still exists to the day. The conflicts, however, with the National Park Service were fairly difficult for the Hualapai and for the Havasupai. The NPS, I've had many contracts and worked with the Park Service for 20 years or so. And their history is very fraught and very colonialist with indigenous peoples. And Hualapais and the Havasupais had a very difficult time with the Park Service. The Hualapai Dam eventually was scuttled. Council members kind of pulled back on that idea. And then the Arizona versus California court case, and then the CAP. If you're in Arizona, you know what CAP stands for. If you're not, it's the Central Arizona Project, this massive water irrigation project that brought water from the Colorado River to Phoenix and then further south. Hualapais were not involved with that. They were excluded from that, and it caused great difficulties for them. In the 1990s, following the court case in 1987, and then the Indian Gaming Regulatory Act in 1988, Hualapais tried to create a casino, but it really failed, primarily due to their distance from large population centers. And then you start to see in the 1980s and 1990s an annual commemorative run. And this kind of goes back to what I started with, the long walk to La Paz. And so Hualapais have a run that goes from the site of La Paz north back to the reservation. And so sort of wrapping things up here with this idea of the long walk to the skywalk, it's more than simply a symbolic, novel use of walk. It somewhat symbolizes the huge arc in history that Hualapais have been through, the pain and the suffering and the historical trauma of the long walk, and then this development, the skywalk, which is controversial to be sure. But the Hualapai have had a long history of, quote, using the river and the canyon. They've had very few economic opportunities available for them. They rejected the dam. For a while, there was discussion of storing uranium on the reservation. The casino failed. They've had very little access to water, just tremendous poverty, unemployment, challenges with healthcare through the 70s, 80s, and early 90s. And so when we get into the 20th century, the idea of cultural tourism or heritage tourism gains traction. And the idea of building this skywalk is sort of born in the western end of the reservation. So it's a horseshoe, essentially. And this is in Grand Canyon West. This began with a partnership or a collaboration with David Jin, a Chinese-American businessman who had casinos in Las Vegas. I was out there many, many times before the skywalk was built. I had lunch on the back of pickup trucks right about there, eating bologna sandwiches and Coke on the back of a truck, and then watched them build this engineering marvel in many ways, as controversial as it is. They unveiled it in 2007. It's about 4,000 feet above the floor of the canyon, made of really amazingly strong 7 layers of glass at the time, constructed and manufactured in Belgium. It may be different now. It was built to sustain winds over 100 miles, a Category 4 earthquake, and thousands of visitors a day. All these, it was very difficult, for instance, to get insurance companies to insure this, but some really amazing, I think it was JPL or the University of California at Berkeley or Caltech came out to stress test it. Geologists looked at the rocks. So it's a really amazing engineering feat. Here you see the final stages of the skywalk from the air. And then a look at the glass at the bottom here. But the construction of the skywalk created a great debate within and out of the Hualapai community. Some of the standard sort of questions, and things tend to be a little bit more complicated than one thing versus another, but the rhetoric at least was, we're building something on sacred ground, but the tribe needs economic development and jobs. We're ruining the environment. it's a 9,000 acre footprint in Grand Canyon West, but also the roads, the dust that things are kicking up, the strain on the water supply, but on the other hand, high unemployment rates. But what we've got also here, though, is indigenous land use and cultural continuity to some extent, survival and resilience. A lot of people said that this was better than uranium mining. It's better than the dam. Some people said we're acting too white, too much money makes us greedy. Some people had a fatalistic notion that we Indians are just poor. And then others said we're moving into the 21st century. There was, however, tremendous conflict with Jin over tribal sovereignty, failure to live up to contractual obligations, and a number of things. And it was a fairly painful, difficult sort of controversy that played out in the news, in public. Jin passed away, and the tribe, quote, resolved the issue of ownership, and this led to control of the Skywalk by the Hualapai, the economic end of the tribe. I'm not as familiar with all of the details of that conflict, and I know that it did cause some disputes within the community and within the area, but nonetheless, profits from this, they go to, like casinos, go to helping the community with emergency medical care, diabetes centers, college scholarships, health insurance. So that's an era and a point of Hualapai history that I'm not the most familiar with. So some concluding thoughts. The Skywalk remains controversial, but there's more to Hualapai history and Hualapai society than just the Skywalk. There was a fast and violent conquest in the 1850s and 1860s that led to a traumatic legacy, represented by the long walk and land loss. But also the Hualapais made conscious decisions about how they would grapple with really large forces beyond their control. But the settler colonial society continued, and to some extent continues, to force them into very painful and complex situations. The tribal government and their constitutional reform has been a really interesting element of their history. They maintain a long relationship with the Grand Canyon and the Colorado River. There were, at least when I was there, and maybe still are, trips that elders make with the youth down the river for 2 or 3 weeks to learn about the canyon and the tribe's deep history in the area. And there continues to be a cautious engagement with the world. So I want to end in a somewhat, apologetically self-indulgent sort of moment here with the book launch at the newly created Hualapai Cultural Center. And again, this was in 2010. And for decades, the Cultural Resources Department that Monza Honga ran and that Loretta Jackson Kelly ran, it was in a double-wide trailer. And so I did a lot of my work out of the double-wide trailer and had lots of meetings with folks there. But sometimes the electricity blew out. When the winds were high, the trailer moved. And it was very difficult, but people did the best that they could. And so the Cultural Resources Department and the center here was a really wonderful moment. And I just was very privileged to be able to do a book talk and a book launch there on the reservation first and nowhere else. And so on the left, Wilfred Wataname Jr. and Sr. and Lucille Watahamaji. Really, I credit her as being, my mentor and a good friend when many people might have said, we don't want an Anglo coming onto the reservation writing about us. She kept me, she tried to keep me from making too many faux pas or mistakes. And So I just wanted to sort of end with that, and just sort of again say thank you to Lucille and Wilfred in particular. So I think that's about it. I imagine I went on probably a bit too long. I'm very sorry for that. But we have time for, I think, some questions and discussions. Thank you.
We do indeed. Thank you so much for a fascinating talk. The first question is, what originally inspired you to study and then write about the Hualapai?
Thank you. That's a great question. So essentially, I went to Arizona State University and I got there in 1997. And living on somebody's couch in Phoenix, I didn't really have much to do. And so I drove around all the reservations in Arizona. And I stopped in Peach Springs, which is the main town in Hualapai. And I was really just amazed. It's, beautiful land, beautiful territory. People were really friendly. And I kind of thought, well, this is something that could be a dissertation topic. But I started to do some research and saw that their history was really pretty amazing. Tremendous resilience, but they were also sort of overshadowed in the Southwest by the Navajo, Hopi, Apache, Pueblos. They're a smaller community that scholars didn't really pay much attention to, but in some cases that's a good thing, not to have scholars pay too much attention to you. And so I talked with some folks, and I went down to the American Indian Language Development Institute for the summer in Tucson. And that's where I met Lucille Wadahamaji. And she helped create that language institute. So I met her, and I asked her, do you think Hualapais would be interested in, an outsider writing about them? I had learned about their court case with the Santa Fe Railway, this tremendous resilience. And so she invited me up to the reservation, and that's sort of how things got started.
And I have two questions which I will combine regarding language. Have the Hualapai been able to preserve their language, as many nations tribal communities are struggling to preserve theirs? And do you speak the Hualapai language?
So the Hualapai for a very long time had extremely high language comprehension, and what they call comprehension and production for quite a long time. And so with Lucille's language program, this bilingual education program, they started partnering with Apple in the 1980s. And they created some language software and some Hualapai language books. And so for quite some time, they had high percentages of language production and knowledge. And people still speak the language now. As you would imagine, when television became available in rural areas, and then when internet access was available, that created some kind of challenges and distractions, but alternately it created opportunities. And so I don't know the percentages, but my sense is that Hualapais have a fairly good today language knowledge today. The other question is, yes, I tried for about 2.5 years. The Hualapai have they have a language dictionary, language grammar books. And so I tried studying it, and then I would go up to the reservation and try speaking it. And they just sort of very nicely say, no, you don't have that properly pronounced. And so I tried for quite some time. And what I was able to do was speak with a lot of language speakers, and they were able to help translate some things, and in particular relationships, the sense of space, and plants and topography. And so I tried a good bit, but it's a non-Western language. And I speak some Italian and some Spanish, but the sense of time and space is very different. And so I failed, but I tried.
And what is the status of healthcare for the Hualapai now?
So that's a great question. Broadly speaking, the Indian Health Service provides services, but the Hualapai have in part with some of the profits from the Skywalk, and I mean, at least when I was there, they had, so the tribal gaming compacts allow different numbers of slots. And so they essentially rented a particular number of slots and they traded them. And so they were able to get revenue sharing. And so they put that into really basic needs like a dialysis clinic. I know that there's an expanded health clinic on the reservation. They do a lot of wellness programming. They've built a brand new, well, pretty sure within the past 5 years, a new grocery store and market, because a lot of reservations in urban areas and some very rural areas are what we call food deserts. And so they're struggling with a lot of things like that, high, health indicators like hypertension and diabetes. But people are really working to counteract that. Sandra Irwin, or Sandra Yellowhawk, who's the aunt of Joe Fliesaway, she was one of many individuals that was sort of spearheading wellness clinics. And they work a lot on walking, on having good food and good diets. Across the United States and really across the world in indigenous communities, there's a resurgence of what's called food sovereignty and cooking with indigenous foods. And then Marcy Cranen, who is in the Cultural Resources Department, she was doing gardens and doing youth gardening. So there's a lot of efforts to improve things, and yet there are a lot of structural barriers to improving things like health. And
how have your worldviews changed after interacting with the Hualapai and writing the book?
I'm not entirely sure I understand the question, but I can say that I made a number of very, very good friends there, and it demonstrated to me, it got me to think increasingly deeply about how history is present, and that history is not the past. And we're constantly, Native communities in particular, are constantly struggling with things like historical trauma, the legacies of land loss, but how people like the Hualapai are just sort of indefatigable. I mean, they have to be. But the sense of resilience and the sense of persistence that the Hualapai have and that many other people have, it's astonishing. And so, on the one hand, I struggled with this tremendous frustration and cynicism about the surrounding society. I mean, I would go to Kingman a lot, and it's just flat out racism. I mean, it's just terrible racism. I mean, things that people said to me about, why do you want to work with them? And yet the Hualapai just continued to push and push and endure. And so I think that's kind of a maybe answering your question a bit, but you do have to grapple with those things about the racism of the surrounding society, and then also the persistence and the resilience of Native people.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Shepherd, for spending your time with our audience today. It's been an outstanding program. We have so many more questions. Unfortunately, we won't have time to get to everyone's. We hope our audience will join us again on November 20th for our next online program, Comanches and Germans on the Texas Frontier. Again, online registration details are available on amerind.org. Thank you, Dr. Shepard, for sharing your time and knowledge with us today.
And anybody that is interested, feel free to send me an email. It was in the initial slide, but I'm very easy to find, University of Texas at El Paso, Department of History. So thank you very much, Annie, and everybody enjoy your day.
Thank you, and have a great day, everyone. Bye.